Good afternoon. Welcome to our second webinar on mastitis and cell count for the spring. We hope that this will be useful and just tag on to the last one. All the resources will be available at the end of today with everything that we covered the last time, some other work that I've done with John Crowley lately as well, and we're going to make them all available on Tirlawn Farm Life. If you've got questions today, do text us on 086 180 3947 or email them to questions@tirlawn.com. We'll try and go through as many questions as you can. Unfortunately, we've had a late apology from Fionnuala McCoy, just something has come up that she hasn't been available for us today. She's going to come back to us at another stage and we'll run another webinar with Fionnuala when she's available. So today it's just going to be Joris and myself, and we're going to try to run through as many questions as we can on what bacteria cause mastitis and how do you deal with them? And there's different ways that you can deal with different bacteria. And I think from being on farm, that's sometimes one of the most frustrating things that farmers see. You try something and it doesn't work. And then you're wondering, is it because it was something different or is it that it's just not effective for that bacteria? So we'll try to kick through as many questions as we can. Some of these have come in over the weekend, and just a reminder to text us or email us in. So Joris, most of you know them pretty well at this stage. It's both Joris and myself. So Joris has been with us for about 5 years working as a veterinary advisor, and he's got about 15 years in dairy herd health experience. He, like myself, is a member of the AHI Cell Check Implementation Group and works with the other AHI animal health programs as well. And again, the same as myself and some of the milk supply managers, he's completed the training for the Cell Check Cell Count Solutions program, and we're going to try to talk a little bit about that at the end and actually explain what this is and how it could benefit you as a supplier. Myself, I'm leading out the SecC program for the milk supply team. And what we're trying to do is offer more support and give very practical support to any farmers that are working on improving their cell count. So let's get started. What's mastitis? So, Joris, over to you. What's mastitis?
Thanks, Fionnuala. So what's mastitis? I suppose mastitis is at its core, if we really go back to the definition, it's an inflammation of the mammary gland and not necessarily always an infection as such. But in general, when we talk about mastitis, we obviously mean that there is an indication that a quarter, or at least a quarter, and sometimes more than one quarter, is infected with a bacteria in most cases. But mastitis at its core is actually an inflammation of the cow's udder. And the way that is shown is very much in an increase in SCC or somatic cell count, but also in a quarter being firm, warm, painful for the cow, and sometimes the cow being very sick, obviously. That all of those symptoms can all play part in mastitis.
One of the questions that I get most often on farm, Joris, and that all the milk supply managers hear from time to time, and vets everywhere hear, I've got a really high cell count, but I can't see any mastitis. So farmers will tell us they've checked the stock, they can't see any crudds, they're drawing out cows. I saw it last week on a farm myself, really high somatic cell count cows, but no clinical signs. And that's kind of frustrating. But what does that mean? Is that subclinical mastitis? And if so, why do we need to act on that?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, because it is something that creates a bit of confusion. We're calling all of it mastitis, but there is the clinical and the subclinical mastitis. So when we don't have clear symptoms that the cow is affected, that her quarter is affected, that there are changes in the milk that we can observe, then we talk about subclinical mastitis if all we're seeing is a cell count problem, right? So an increased cell count. Now, a lot of people obviously know the values that are at stake here. So there is obviously the bigger cutoff of the 400,000, above which penalties kick in. There is the 200,000, but these are all at bulk tank level. If you really bring it down to individual cow level, then you'd have to actually say that for a cow to say that she has this inflammation of her udder, if her cell count goes above 150,000, we would actually say that that's not a completely healthy udder. If you're talking about a first lactation animal, by the way, a calf heifer, the cutoff there is 125,000. Okay, so that's just showing that at an individual cow level, inflammation of the udder, as expressed by cell count, so subclinical mastitis, is very different from what we're looking at the cutoffs at bulk tank level. So 125,000 for your calf heifers, 150,000 for your cows. And if there then are changes in the milk, clots in the milk, or if the quarter is warm or painful, if the cow is very uncomfortable, then that makes it a clinical mastitis. But in general, cows with a subclinical mastitis, so no clear signs other than on a milk recording, you find that she has a high cell count, or the CMT paddle test is showing that she has a high cell count. Those cows are just as worrisome from spreading infection as the cows that do have those changes in the milk.
Thanks. So moving on from that, one of the pieces that we always suggest to suppliers is to actually start to take some samples. And the best way to do that is take some sterile samples. We'd always suggest that everybody takes them just from the most infected quarter. Use a CMT paddle beforehand, because sometimes what you'll find, and what we see as well, is that cows go up and down a little bit in their cell count. So if you're using your paddle, then take a sample just from the most infected quarter on that day. And sometimes we'll have a look then at the cultures coming back. So Joris, I suppose that's bringing me to cultures and why they're so important to do. And I'm going to have a video available later on the actual process of taking cultures, so we'll worry about that when later on. But I guess, what are the different types of bacteria, Joris? And I suppose one of the ones that we come across all the time that probably drives people pretty mad is Staph aureus. And what can you tell us as a vet about Staph aureus and the cure rates on farm, and why it seems to be a different one?
Yeah, and I'll come to the Staph aureus later on, but I think the first distinction, and it may not be the most accurate categorization that's out there, but it is categorizing the bacteria into what's a contagious bacteria or an infectious type of mastitis, and then the environmental type of mastitis. And a lot of people still use that sort of compartmentalization, or if you want, or categorization of bacteria, because it makes it easier to focus on the areas where changes can be made, or where more focus needs to be in order to correct the situation. So in general, we would say, okay, the infectious type of bacteria, they're the ones that actually, they live either in the udder, in the cow's udder already, or on the cow's teat skin, or they can live on your own hands, on your own skin as well, for example, and I'll come back to that when we talk about Staph aureus. But the whole point there is that those bacteria cannot survive well or at all in the cow's environment. They need to be associated with the cow and stay on the cow to survive. And so any sort of spread of those bacteria is also associated with a direct spread from one cow to the next cow. There's no time that those bacteria can spend on a cubicle or somewhere else in the environment that would allow them to transfer to another cow. They wouldn't survive that. Whereas the environmental bacteria, they're that type of bacteria where actually they are quite often normal enough environmental bacteria, so bacteria that live in the cow's environment, but when they do get into the teat canal, they can cause some very severe mastitis. And one of the best known examples there would be an E. coli mastitis. Everybody who has milked cows would have seen this, and is rightly a bit afraid of an E. coli mastitis, because the cows can suffer a lot from an E. coli mastitis, and they're so quick to happen that you're always too late in a lot of ways, right? And it's just that the cow reacts so strongly to those infections with a high inflammatory response. So she'll have a high temperature, she'll be weak, she might not be able to get up, and she'll have this very watery type of milk from the infected quarter. And that's a very typical environmental E. coli specific mastitis. Whereas the contagious or the infectious type of bacteria, the ones that can only survive on the cows, Staph aureus would be the prime example. So that brings me to the second part of your question, Fionnuala, Staph aureus. So it's the most common bacteria that we're still finding in our cultures from any samples that are sent in. Okay, it has been for a long time. Internationally, it's probably still the most common mastitis causing bacteria. Part of that is because it can survive so well on skin, the animal skin, but also people's skin. And I often say, look, Staph aureus is a very normal skin bacteria, but it also lives in your nose, for example, right? A lot of people will have Staph aureus in their nose, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you think about if you're milking cows and every time you're in the pit milking cows, how often do you wipe your nose and then go and milk a cow? Every time you do that, there is a potential that you've taken that Staph aureus out of your nose and put it on the cow's teeth. And on cold mornings like we have now, there's a lot of runny noses out there. Let's just put it that way, right? So it does happen. It's so easy to transfer those bacteria because they are so well designed in that direct transfer. Now, Staph aureus is a tricky one, right? Because once it establishes itself in a cow's quarter, it's very difficult to get rid of. Staph aureus is so well adapted that once it gets into the teeth, into the quarter, what it does is it will establish itself in little clusters that build up little defensive walls around, so little abscesses. And any sort of treatment that you give those animals because you've seen a spike in cell count, the Staph aureus will actually build up more defenses. And so the antibiotics may not always reach those animals or those bacteria to actually get rid of the infection. But what happens is after a while, those bacteria will then burst out of those abscesses and cell count will just shoot up again. So quite often when we see herds that have a more chronic issue with cell count, but recurring cases of mastitis within the same lactation in the same animal, very, very often it's actually Staph aureus that's there. And it's such a difficult one to deal with as long as the cow is in lactation.
So picking up just on what you said there, Joris, obviously the best cure rates for something like Staph aureus come during the dry period, and that's because you tend to use longer acting antibiotics and things like that. So if a farmer is calving down cows now, and one of the questions actually that's come in on this is that at the dry off last year, one of our farmers says that they culled some chronic cows with Staph aureus and they treated more recently infected cows. Should he sensitivity test cows now once they're coming in? And I suppose he's looking at trying to figure out, has he gotten rid of all his problem, or is there likely to be a Staph aureus piece? He's very conscious that he had a Staph aureus problem. And what should be the strategy in a herd where you know you have Staph aureus, you used your dry period to really target it? What should you do at the start of this year, maybe to try to stop it getting a further foothold in a herd?
In a herd like that, where they know they have a Staph aureus issue and have dealt with it in the previous lactation or lactations, and they've really looked at their dry cow treatment and really targeted those animals that are known to have the infection. Hopefully the dry period has done what it's supposed to do, and it's the best chance that those animals will have for a cure. But now coming into the new lactation, it's about looking at the records and seeing, okay, which cows do we need to keep extra focus on now, because we know they had an issue last lactation. They were treated specifically for that reason. So now, after calving, we want to
I think we've just had a sound problem here. Joris's mic has just cut out. I'm going to pick up while we try to fix his mic. One of the things that he just started to talk about is a follow on from that question, and farmers that are now doing CMTs and trying to see, well, what do they do? So one of the common pieces sometimes with Staph aureus cows is that actually they start to come in and look really good on the paddle. And one of the questions that we actually got from a farmer to follow on from that last one is, if they are going really well on the CMT this year, can they assume that they're actually cured from the dry period, or how long do I need to monitor them? And I guess, again, just while waiting for Joris to come back in, the most important thing about that is the word monitoring, actually. And it's great if you've got CMT as part of your routine in a parlour. It really makes a difference. It's so instant. And sometimes you will see cows that you know are high and they will go low and you can't see anything in the paddle. And then a few days later, they'll go high. So I would be always saying just stay monitoring, keeping an eye on them. And then obviously stepping into, when you do your milk recording, you're going to know whether their cell count is actually still high or low. And it is very much a frustrating piece out there, because sometimes high cows will be very high in 1 week and then they will appear to go low. Some work that was done by Peter Edmondson a number of years ago actually looked at this over a few days and actually was able to look at the big fluctuations between the amount of bacteria that are shed from knowingly infected Staph aureus cows and also the cell count. And really the fluctuations in it are quite interesting to see. So a big piece around it is, now that you've come out of your dry period and your cows are milking down, you've made your best shot at curing them because you've had a good dry period, drying off, and good technique there and the best possible antibiotics. And what you're trying then to do is actually see whether you're going to keep the milking on 3/4, perhaps might be an option, or whether that cow needs to exit your herd. And then managing that cow while she's still in your herd, it's actually really important. Even if you've decided that you're not going to breed her or anything, it's important to manage her so she doesn't spread infection. So I think Joris is back in with me there. So Joris, just in case I've missed anything there, is what else would you say to farmers around managing in Staph aureus other than monitoring, and how important that is? And it's good to assume, I think really what's what you're saying, that cows are not necessarily cured until you're really sure they're cured.
Yeah, it's hard to say that a cow is definitely cured from Staph aureus, and unless you can see from your records, your milk recording, and so on, that she doesn't have these flare-ups in cell count anymore. Once you're not seeing those in the cow, in I suppose the current lactation, and she did have them in the previous lactation, I think we're safe enough to say that okay, you managed to eliminate that infection. But because we're so early in the lactation at the moment, you have no certainty in that right now. You can't say that right now. So I think your paddle test is a good start, okay? But I think that first milk recording is going to be very telling, because it will give us a very accurate reading of, this is what the cow was like before drying off. This is what she's like in the new lactation. Has there been improvement or not? And the ones that haven't improved, they're the ones you really want to target and see, well, is it indeed still a Staph aureus infection, or is there something else going on? Yeah.
And I guess bringing that out, because it actually feeds into the next set of questions that I've got. Sometimes that's a perception that we can have, is that because she was infected with X last year and she calves down again, or she starts to look like she has mastitis, it could be the same thing, but actually it could be something else, particularly around calving, because of the environmental threat. And we know from all the work that's been done on mastitis that the last 14 days of the dry period and the first 14 days are actually when the cow is most vulnerable. And that makes sense. I mean, she's more stressed, and also the conditions are changing so fast from her. But I've got a set of questions here that have actually come in around liming, and they kind of link together nicely. So one is around what percentage of hydrated lime would you recommend on cubicles for post-calving? Also, should you lime twice a day? Is it effective? It's a lot of work. Is it worth doing? And then the third one has just come in, and it's actually the other way around. It's for cubicles without roofs. You know, it's difficult to lime there, particularly the wet weather we've had. So what do you do there, and what can you rely on instead? So just any comments around the liming, Joris? I know Teagasc have done some good work on it, but do you want to give a comment on that, please?
Yeah, and like you said, Fionnuala, Teagasc have done some brilliant work actually on evaluating different liming methods and frequencies and whatnot, and to be honest, I actually can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head. They came out with an amount of lime that should be used rather than an actual percentage of hydrated lime, if I remember correctly.
170 grams.
107, there you go. Thanks, Fionnuala. 170 grams of hydrated lime per cubicle every time you lime the cubicle. And that is a very important part too. For milking cows, I would very strongly recommend that you use hydrated lime twice a day. On dry cows, you can probably get away with once a day, but you should do it that the cubicles are still dry. And that's the real benefit of this liming, is it keeps the cubicles dry, because dryness is what bacteria don't like, right? If there's moisture, if there's leaked milk or other moisture on the cubicles, that's where bacteria thrive. So the lime, yes, it has disinfectant properties, but also that drying out of the cubicles is such an important property, and you only get that if you're liming your cubicles twice a day, as long as the cows are still fully housed. If they're going outside during the day, then maybe only having to lime after the evening milking when they stay in for the night or something, that might be enough. But as long as the cows are making full use of the cubicle shed, you really should be looking at liming twice a day. Now, add to that liming is an important step. It keeps the cubicles clean, but don't forget, it only works in conjunction with good teat disinfectant, right? You have to make sure that there is no bacteria or limited bacteria coming from the cow to contaminate the cubicle at the start when they lie down after milking. So disinfecting after milking is such an important step to keep that contamination level of the cubicle down on top of the lining. The other piece about if we're looking at, there's some other products out there and so on as well, but I think it's been shown that hydrated lime truly is the best product to use. And I can't remember what the third question was, Fionnuala, actually.
The third question was actually around topless cubicles without a roof on them. How do you manage those? And I guess particularly look at the weekend we've had with so much rain. It's very difficult to keep those dry. So what do you advise farmers there?
Well, I could be cheeky here and just say, well, you should put a roof over the cubicles, because that's really what you should be doing. It's impossible to keep the topless cubicles dry during this time of year. It's nigh impossible. And even, with lime, you're not going to make much of a dent there. If you lime the cubicle and there's a shower that comes in, that's actually all that effort gone. So it goes back to make sure the cows are well disinfected before they go into those cubicles. Make sure they have at least half an hour to stand after milking before they get access to the cubicle and are able to lie down, because that crucial half hour at least allows the teat to close again, so that if the cubicle, which we know is not going to be perfectly clean, at least then the bacteria that are on the cubicle don't just get a free pass to walk right into the teat. Okay, so, and on top of that, then it's about scraping those cubicles regularly, making sure that at least any gross contamination is reduced to a minimum in those.
Thanks, Joris. And actually, that piece around the scraping of the cubicles, a lot of the time we do actually talk about the liming, but it's actually really important to actually scrape down the cubicles. That also leads to the other piece around now, when calving really is in full swing and you're moving cows from your cubicle groups into your calving pens. It can be quite tempting at times to turn off the scrapers so that you don't have calves being born in there, because that can be a problem. And we all know the calves don't get the best start there. So you're trying to watch and make sure that they don't get caught there. But it is just important to remember to turn it back on and to keep the passageways clear, because if they really start to build up muck, that is when we get a lot of environmental bacteria showing. One of the other questions that we've gotten, it's a really good one. It's come from somebody who does a lot of selective dry, and it's around the move away from antibiotics. And what we're finding on a lot of farms is that if you do your selective dry cow selection, and I use the word selection, so actually selecting your cows right and actually making sure you've assessed your housing and things like that, it's working really well on farm. This is a question around, well, what are the alternatives down the track around, if we're not going to be using antibiotic? And is there any investigations or opinions available yet on the science side of it, on the non-antibiotic type products that this farmer wanted to know, such as the boluses, the herbal remedies and things like that, around as a treatment for mastitis? And I suppose I'd add a piece around that, maybe explain the concept of self-cure. That's something we talk to farmers a little bit about as well. So yeah, just some opinions on that would be appreciated. Thanks, Joris.
Yeah, I suppose the self-cure is an interesting one because it has been researched a good bit, and the ability of the cow to self-cure an infection, whether it's a mastitis or another infection, but that really ties in with the overall capability of the cow and her immune system. Okay, so an animal that is well nourished, that is exposed to low enough stress levels and so on, will be much more capable of fighting off infections, and mastitis is a prime example there. So there is certainly a degree of self-cure that our cows will have, and a capacity for it. And there are a lot of factors that come into that, and even things like the elasticity of the teat, and how well the sphincter can close, if there's any T10 damage, anything like that comes into that as well, because if the cow is more prone to get infection, she'll struggle more to actually clear it, and so on. So that's the self-cure piece. There is definitely something there. Our cows, if they are in a healthy state, are definitely able to do a good level and a high degree of self-cure. The non-antibiotic treatments, there is a lot of development being done there, and a lot of people are researching and developing these cures, because we need to move away from the blanket use of antibiotic, and we have made the first steps in that, and some herds are a bit further along the journey than others with the selective dry cow therapy. And now we're starting to look at, okay, now for the lactating cow, what alternatives have we there that we don't have to go in with mastitis tubes for every cow? And so, okay, self-cure is one piece. So have the cow in a healthy state, have a very active immune system. That will help her a lot. Some of these boluses and other treatments have come on the market, claiming to support maybe the immune system, or sometimes being marketed as some form of a solution, and I fully realize everybody's very careful to not call them a treatment, because that puts them in a completely different category. I think the outcomes are definitely mixed, and there are different types of boluses and so on, and different programs depending on which bolus you use, but the results are somewhat mixed in my opinion. Okay, so if I look at the conversations I've had over the last couple of years, and farmers tell me the bolus works 50% of the time, then my first impression is, well, 50% of the time the cow probably would have self-cured. So is it the bolus, or was it the cow that was just able to do it herself anyway? It's very hard to make that decision. Okay, the issue I have with some of these boluses is they obviously have to be given a chance to work, and they take time to actually show results. But that could be very crucial time that is being wasted in the case the bolus is not successful, and the bacteria get a much longer time to now establish themselves. And now we're having to go back to our antibiotics that we know will work, but we've given the bacteria a much longer head start. So that's my concern with some of these boluses, that people are using them maybe not necessarily as indicated, or maybe not on the right cows, and therefore the treatment, the antibiotic treatment that has been shown to work in the past, is now being delayed, and the success rate of the antibiotic will then suffer in that. So I think we have to be a little bit careful with some of the boluses that are out there. We do really want to see the signs before we make a final call on them, is where I would leave it, Fionnuala.
Right, thank you for that, Joris. Got another couple of questions, and what I'm doing in the background too is actually putting up some slides. Most of the content of this slides actually comes from the CellTech guidelines, and I guess as advisors and as vets, we always go back to that, because that was kind of the science book that's gone into I suppose putting all the facts down around mastitis control in Ireland. So we would refer you to the CellTech guidelines. But Joris has covered a lot of this. How do you actually deal with infected cows, and how do you cure the infection, and how do you remove the cows? But actually, one of the really big focuses on farm needs to be reducing the risk of spreading infection. And this comes nicely from a question. I'm putting up the slide behind in the background here, but one of the questions that we've just had pop into us in the chat is just a comment on cluster flushing. And I suppose as someone who's on farm all the time working with infected herds, cluster flushing is great. And I would say it's absolutely super, but I still don't see it as a silver bullet. I've seen really good effects of it, where it actually does a really nice job to protect your non-infected cows, but it won't necessarily cure your cows. So back to some of those cure things that Joris was covering. So I would say to people, weigh up what are you trying to address. The most important thing is always about segregating your cows and making sure that your infected cows are not going to actually infect the uninfected cows. And to do that, I would always say go back to milk recording and making sure you're doing an early milk recording and actually getting a handle on which cows are infected or uninfected. So cluster flush, Joris, I've seen it work really well on farms. And I actually think even as advisors, we're beginning to embrace it more because it's automation. It's probably better than dipping clusters because it's very difficult to dip clusters effectively all the time. It's very, very difficult. But sometimes doing things like running separate herds works as well and things like that. But Joris, do you have any opinion on cluster flush?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the cluster flush creates a type of segregation within the herd without actually physically having to segregate the herd into a healthy herd and an infected herd, if you will, or a healthy low cell count cohort and a high cell count cohort that is able to spread infection to that first group. So what cluster flush really does is it limits the ability of an infected cow to spread her bacteria to potentially the next 8 animals milked off the same cluster, because that is what the science has shown, that bacteria that can be transferred through the milking cluster that can go up to 8 cows. Now, cluster flush, like Fionnuala said, it's not the silver bullet, and I've seen it work very well in some herds, and I've also seen it have no effect at all in other herds. One of the key things that we need to remember is that cluster flush will only work if your liners are changed frequently enough as well. Because when the cluster flush works is when the cluster is obviously no longer attached to the cow, there's no vacuum being applied, and the rubber lining in the cluster is actually completely relaxed. But worn rubber liners will have these little cracks. It's like the little cracks you see on the side of a tractor tire that's overdue a change. Those cracks will open and close as the cluster is being worked by the vacuum. And so bacteria will get into those little cracks and will not get flushed out by the cluster flush when it's being applied to a relaxed cluster. So when cluster flush is put in place in a herd, where do you see the best effects? Quite often it's in herds where maybe there's a number of people milking and where there is already a good management of plant maintenance, cluster liners being changed frequently enough, the vacuum being in a good place and so on. It's a good addition to it because it creates that consistency throughout the daily milking. Doesn't matter who's doing the milking, the clusters are always left the exact same way. I think that summarizes it somewhat as to where I think cluster flush fits. It's not the silver bullet, but it certainly has a role to play.
That's great, thanks, Joris. And yeah, it's one of the tools in the toolbox. And to be fair, you can now get it retrofitted to parlours. There was a time where you could only put it on a new parlour, and you either made your decision at the start of putting together your new parlour, or if you didn't have a new parlour being built, you didn't have an option. It is out there, but we do encourage people actually to stick to the basics, milk record first and segregate, and then figure out how to best deal with the infected cows. So it's not a silver bullet, but it works quite well. One of the questions that's actually come in around resistance is around the resistance to antibiotics. I'm just trying to read it here. How and why does it occur on farm? Does it mean you've overused that, or is it just the bacteria you have? And one of the other pieces that a farmer has asked us is one of the antibiotics that they have tried to use, matching cultures and working with their vet, didn't seem to cure. And is this still resistance? So I guess this is probably a scenario where their culture report told them that the bacteria they have is sensitive to a certain antibiotic, and maybe perhaps that hasn't worked. And is that resistance, Joris, or is it just something else? What's happening possibly where antibiotics that you think should work? And then I suppose maybe give a little bit of background about antibiotic resistance, and maybe that's one of the big pieces we're all talking about at the moment.
Yeah, I suppose one thing that we have to keep in mind when it comes to antibiotic resistance and the way the culture and sensitivity results are reported is that the culture and sensitivity results are based on what the lab identifies. Okay, so it's bacteria grown in a lab environment, and then they're tested against a number of antibiotics to see whether or not the antibiotic is able to kill the bacteria that were grown in the lab. In reality, in the life environment, that might be a different scenario because there are other factors that come into play. And even earlier on, I spoke about Staph aureus and Staph aureus being to build up this defensive wall and the abscess in which it lives. If the lab shows that the Staph aureus is actually susceptible to a certain antibiotic, but that antibiotic is then being used on bacteria that are able to put up defensive walls, then or survive in a biofilm or something like that, then it seems as if the antibiotic is not working in reality. But maybe the antibiotic is also not getting a chance to actually work. And Staph aureus is a very good example, again, that for a milking cow, it's very difficult to be treated for Staph aureus because quite often the general treatments, the general mastitis tubes, are not being given long enough to actually complete the course for Staph aureus specific. So there may be adjustments needed to actually show that that antibiotic is truly working against the bacteria as the lab results indicate, but it's because the way the treatment was implemented that maybe we weren't getting the real effect. Now, there is a certain degree of antibiotic resistance, and some of it is natural, by the way, right? Some bacteria are just not susceptible to certain antibiotics, and by nature they've never been susceptible. So that's not a new development of antimicrobial resistance that's come in, but there are some. But in general, from the results we're seeing in the lab, there have not been that many surprises in that sense. Usually it's the expected antibiotics that work and the expected ones that won't work against whatever bacteria we're growing in the lab. But sometimes we do see a surprise. And in that situation, it's very important that you sit down with your vet, review those results, and decide on, okay, what is the best alternative treatment? Because the one that maybe I have been using for the past year or 2 years or 3 years clearly is not working because the lab has found that the bacteria themselves have genes that make them resistant to that bacteria, that antibiotic. So what you're saying is I should answer this one quickly, Fionnuala. So look, doing 10 milkings in 7 days, obviously it works. On some farms it works very well, and it does take the pressure off from a labor perspective. Usually over the weekends is where it's planned. In a herd that has a cell count currently, or maybe over the summer of 100,000, I would say absolutely that can be implemented. Okay, that herd and the cows within that herd are probably in a very good position, a very good situation to cope with that. However, in herds where there are more or a higher cell count, or more cows with a higher cell count, we would see that if you were to reduce the number of milkings, that the cell count is going to go up, because milking itself creates a mechanical expulsion of bacteria from the infected quarters. So If you lower the frequency of milking, those bacteria get a better chance to build up, to multiply, and to establish themselves within those quarters. So you would see an increase in cell count. But in a herd where mastitis and cell count is well controlled, it should be manageable and shouldn't actually affect the cell count significantly.
Thanks, Joris. And I think by the sounds of it, there was actually a problem with my sounds. That was a question just being asked around reducing milking frequency on farm, but that should come out pretty well on the recording of the webinar. Finally, just to finish off, I think one of the things that I do want to actually call out today is that there's one of the areas that we're working with AHI is around the cell count program, obviously, but there's a cell count solutions program visits available on farm. And this is something that we found works really, really well for farmers. And what it is, it's through the Cell Check program, and it's a free Department of Ag covering the cost of a vet to come out and work with you on farm to do a mastitis investigation. They involve us as the milk supply managers, and you can also involve your technician and your Teagasc advisor. We're finding that it's giving support where it's needed most. It's practical and on farm, and it's basically a team investigation. And what we're finding is that farmers are finding that it's useful because you've got a couple of voices and a couple of opinions, and maybe sometimes it's easy to talk about all the different possibilities, but what this will actually do is drill down and maybe agree with the farmer, and the farmer takes control of this. What are the actions they're going to take in the next 6 months or the next year? So to sign off our webinar today, I'm actually going to play it out with a video just from a farmer that we've been working with on the Cell Check, on the Cell Count Solutions program, and his vet. So we want to thank you, first of all, for logging in today. We'll have all our resources available over the next short while on our Tier Lawn Farm Life website. So you should be able to catch up with the webinars that we've run and any of the questions. Thank you for your time. Thank you to Joris, and thanks for the IT team here who've been trying to keep us on the straight and narrow, even if we weren't the best on the sound today. So thank you very much for everybody, and have a good day. I hope calving continues to go well on farm. Maybe the weather will improve a little bit, and wishing you safe farming. Thank you. Cell Count Solutions is an AHI Cell Check program initiative that's sponsored by the Department of Ag that the milk quality advisors from processes across the country, including ourselves at Tier Lawn, have gotten involved with farmers. What it involves is a farmer signing up to a service that will help link a milk quality advisor, their vets and themselves together to help tackle any cell count queries or issues that they have. The whole idea is that everybody works together so that the farmer ends up with a really well mapped out plan of actions that he can take over the next 6 to 12 months. Today we're on a farm in Waterford that's worked with the Cell Count Solutions program, and it'll be nice to hear what his experience has been with this program and to see how he and his vet and their milk quality advisor have pulled together proactive actions to address cell count.
We had a problem here with cell count for a couple of years, so we said we'd tackle it this year and see can we hit it in the head and come back down to normal and get to the root of the problems. That we signed up for the program. We saw it online, and so we signed up for it. Then we had to nominate our vet and our consultant. We milk record here every month for the last number of years, so at least we could go back and see what cows are giving trouble, and then with the help we're able to see with other lads looking at the results to see if we're dealing with the right cows, and we could see a pattern running through with cows that were problematic all through the year, or that some would go down and come back up again. So wider recordings helped us out an awful lot. Very much like when you're here milking, we just run cows through and you're looking at them, but when you have another set of eyes and people coming in telling you this is a trouble one, see what can we do with it, can we treat her. It was a free tool for us, like that we got the help from our consultant, our vets, to help us come in, and when we had problems we could contact them with problems.
The request will come to me through AHI. I'll get an email and it'll be a request saying, look, if X supplier farmer wants to tackle a cell count issue. First thing I will do is I'll contact the farmer. I'll clarify, look, what information we have in terms of particularly milk recording. Then the other thing is, it's a question of talking with milk quality advisor, the milking machine technician, if necessary Teagasc advisor, whoever is in whichever we decide is involved in the team. Tackling a cell count problem is never just one simple thing. Everybody needs to be involved in one way or another. I mean, you've got to look at the cows themselves, you've got to look at the milking facility, milking routine, the nutrition, the management, the housing. So there's so many different aspects to it that it's never just one simple thing, and a lot of people need to be involved in order to identify where the problem lies. Because at the end of the day, if you've got a high cell count problem, which means a mastitis problem, it's about the cow's defences being weakened in one way or another, and that's not always easy to identify as to where the problem or problems might lie. Whereas it's not an absolute requirement under the programme to be milk recording, really, if you want to get the benefit of it, you will need to be milk recording, because otherwise we don't have the information both at the herd level and, more importantly, at the individual cow level to let us identify where the problems are and to then work on from there, whether it's with culturing and sensitivity, monitoring individual cows. If we don't have milk recording data, really it's very difficult to get results. Now, as well as that, some people may be familiar with the selective dry cow therapy program. And again, obviously, if you've had a cell count that's been running over 200,000, you wouldn't be going there yet, because that would be one of the criteria for looking at selective dry cow therapy. But if you're going to do that, then really you can't do that unless you have milk recording data, because you can't identify the cows which might need a dry cow period treatment and others where they don't need antibiotic and where the sealer will do perfectly well. I suppose at the end of the day, a lot of where we go then is about making decisions and assisting the herd owner in making decisions, often about maybe individual cows or making decisions about treatment. And often it'll come down to, well, do I keep milking this cow or do I not? Because whereas there might be a great attachment to an animal for whatever reason, if it's going to be a potential source for others of infection, then really you have to make a decision that do you keep it or not.
To get involved with the AHI Cell Count Solutions Programme, just link back with your milk supply manager or myself as the Cell Count Programme Manager for Fionnuala. We'll help get you registered online and get you established with your team of service providers that are going to help you come up with a really good cell count management programme for 2024.